My talk is a little more general than archive. It's maybe sort of setting the stage for, like maybe placing archive a little bit in context for you. And I understand, actually, first off, let me say that a PDF of my slides will be available to you if it isn't already on the guide. There are some live links that will kind of breeze by and maybe not follow in my talk. Don't worry about it, because you'll be able to go back and follow them later. So I understand that open access came up a little bit yesterday. So who here is pretty comfortable with the notion of open access and what it means, open access publishing? Pretty comfortable? Anybody here publish an open access paper? Excellent. Okay, so some experience, some experts, but probably worth a deeper dive. That's my thinking. So let's start with a little bit of a definition. And in the early 2000s, there were at least 3 major conventions, declarations, kind of I don't know, powwows, I guess, devoted to thinking about open access. And they all kind of converged on a definition very much like this one that says open access literature is digital and online. It's free of charge to read and free of most copyright and licensing restrictions, meaning pretty free to reuse in various ways. We're going to focus mainly on the free to read aspect of open access today. So what are some reasons for making scientific literature free to read online? I mean, you all have access to a tremendous library here, and it's sort of invisible maybe to you whether or not something costs anyone to read, because you have access to so much just through the library. But what are some reasons to maybe make your work available freely? Anyone?
More people can read it?
More people can read it. Yeah, I mean, it would be really unfortunate if smart people with perhaps less privileged access to expensive information than us had difficulty in doing their work simply because they can't get access to the journals that they need. So that's one. And I think all of us would like to see science move forward by allowing as many people as possible to have access to the information that they need. Another reason is this notion of research as a public good that is especially emerging with government funding agencies and private foundations that want to maximize their return on the investment in the research that they fund by making sure that the results of the research they fund are freely accessible. If that is taxpayer-funded research, you could make the case that the taxpayers have a right to it. So there's kind of a noble impulse there. Research belongs to the people that pay for it. Another way to think about it is if you receive federal funding or private funding with a requirement that your work be made available open access, it may be a requirement whether you share that noble impulse or not. And then for libraries, there's this very real issue of unsustainable journal pricing, and I won't dwell on it. I just want to show you this one graph. I'm sorry about all the fine print. What you need to see is that top line, which is over the last 3 or so decades, the percent change in what libraries spend or the cost to libraries for journal pricing. And this royal blue line is the total library expenditure. So you can see how journals are really one of the main drivers for increasing costs to libraries. And trust me, our budgets are not increasing at that rate. So this is a real issue for us. And then we'll dive a little bit into kind of like the taxonomy or types of open access publishing and how you can publish open access. But I want to tackle a few very common misconceptions about open access publishing first. And I'm curious how many of you have heard or read any of these. So how many of you have heard somebody say open access journals are not peer reviewed? How many of you have heard someone say open access journals are poor quality or low quality? And how about open access journals always rely on author charges? Okay, not as common. So it is true that there are some open access journals without a peer review process. And it is true that there are some low quality open access journals. It is also true that there are some subscription-based journals that do not have a peer review process and that are poor quality. So quality and peer review do not go hand in hand with open access. Those are independent decisions made by the journal, its publisher, and that can be true of a whole or subscription-based journal or an open access journal. So it's really best to evaluate individual journals on their own merits rather than saying, oh, open access, it must be low quality. That's not necessarily the case. It is often the case that open access journals charge authors for the privilege of publishing, because if you think about it, they're not charging readers or libraries. They need some way to recover their costs to provide the publication that they're providing. So if they're not getting money from readers or libraries, who will they get money from? They may charge authors. It's not universally true. Some journals have other sources of revenue. They might be bankrolled by a foundation or other organization, for example. So these things are sometimes true, but not always true. Great, thank you. Any questions about that? Henrik?
What kind of costs would you say incorporate costs for open access
You know, I would say, I mean, if people are willing to volunteer their labor, and if they are, you know, working in an organization with access to basic infrastructure, like, for example, you know, we maintain a digital repository, eCommons. We have plans to offer access to an open source journal publishing platform. If people are willing to do the work for free and their institution has the infrastructure that they need, it could be done for nothing or close to nothing, but you have to recognize there's a lot of volunteer labor there and maybe some hidden costs, the library perhaps bearing the cost of operating the repository or the journal publishing platform. But it can be done inexpensively. If you want to get into marketing, if you want an editorial assistant, if you want to pay copy editors, you want to pay a graphic designer, that all that kind of thing starts to cost money. Okay, let's talk about some types of open access you may hear about. One is not open access. So I've been referring to that as toll access or subscription-based publishing. Two other types of open access, you'll frequently hear these terms, and we'll unpack them a little bit, are green and gold, and those have to do with who is providing access to the publication. So if the author is providing access to a copy of their paper, that's known as green. If the publisher is providing access, it's known as gold. But of course, it's not quite that simple. Let's taking a closer look at gold open access, meaning the publisher is providing access. Kind of the best case scenario is that the publisher is publishing a fully open access journal and all their papers are freely available. Another scenario, and this is where I want to kind of caution you against relying on these terms to understand what's going on with the journal, because publishers use them creatively, maybe even misuse them, I think, to their advantage. There's something known as hybrid open access, where a toll access journal will, for a fee, allow you as the author to publish just that one paper open access. So it's a subscription journal with some papers published open access. And if you think about it, that's really the best business model ever, because that journal is still charging libraries or readers subscription fees, and they're charging the author. And in theory, a scrupulous publisher could choose to discount the subscriptions that libraries pay. In practice, that's very hard to verify and track. And we even had a couple years ago a visit from a large publisher that I won't name, but basically they said to us when we asked about this practice of double dipping, as we call it, they said, well, you know, we could discount your subscription fees, but in fact, you're giving us so much money already, it really doesn't matter. So why bother? So it's a little bit of a misnomer to refer to hybrid open access as some kind of gold standard for open access publishing. Should you choose to pay a publisher for the privilege of publishing open access, hybrid or not, hopefully fully open access, a couple things I'd like you to know about potentially paying those charges. One is most funders consider this an allowable expense. So if you and your advisor are working on a grant, you presumably you know you're going to publish the results of your research, and you can budget for that. In National Science Foundation budget form, it's line G2 for costs related to publication, dissemination, and documentation. So just plan for it, and you can get that covered by your grant. If you don't have a source of funding to pay one of these charges, many institutions have an open access fund. Cornell has one, Cornell Open Access Fund, the COPE Fund. Do know that not all authors and articles will qualify for that funding. What matters at Cornell is that fund now has a focus on early career researchers, so graduate students, postdocs, early career faculty. And so that's good news for you. The papers that qualify are ones that will be published in fully open access journals with a couple of conditions. One being that they be listed in the directory of open access journals that I'll talk about in a moment. So do know that if you don't have another source of funding to pay one of these author charges, there is help available on the Cornell campus, and there may be whatever university you end up at after this. Before you do pay anybody any money, I do recommend that you check the journal out. It's an unfortunate occasional occurrence that an unscrupulous publisher will see this transaction as an opportunity to quickly stand up a website, make it look like a journal, and start charging people and posting papers without really providing the kind of normal suite of publishing services one expects from a quality journal. So you do want to check them out. There are a couple easy ways to do that. One is to look up the journal in the directory of open access journals, or DOAJ. There's a small army of volunteer editors that use established criteria to evaluate journals for quality and legitimacy and transparency and sound business practices. Do know that it takes a little bit of time. It's a little bit of a process to get listed in DOAJ. So it's entirely possible that a high quality new journal is not yet listed. And so if you are really interested in publishing someplace that isn't listed, you might still want to perform your own assessment, and there's a useful checklist on the Think, Check, Submit website, especially if you go to that website and go to the check page. Their checklist very closely resembles the checklist used by DOAJ editors. So you can look something up in DOAJ, you can perform your own assessment, and make sure that the journal is legitimate. Any questions about that before we move on? I think, yeah, so green is next. I just want to reiterate that the green and gold terms, again, I don't want you to rely on those to understand what's going on with the journal. I want you to look at their practices, look at the editor's practice, the publisher's practices to make your decision, rather than saying, oh, green, here we go, gold, here we go. Do just try and understand what the particular journal is doing. So again, green open access is when the author provides access to a copy of their paper, and that's also known as self-archiving. Many publishers allow this, even if they're traditional toll access publishers. In order to know if you can self-archive a paper, you need to hang on to your publishing agreement, read it, understand it, maybe negotiate it. I think you heard probably about that yesterday from Amy Digert. This is one place where that comes into play. You want to understand what that publisher requires with respect to the version that you are allowed to post, and I'll explain the different versions that are usually under consideration, and whether or not you're allowed to post something immediately or after a 6 or 12 month delay or some other delay. And there are two, in addition to a publishing agreement, there are two kind of other ways to figure out what your options are. One, and this is especially important if you haven't submitted yet, you don't have a publishing agreement, you're trying to make a decision, you can look around the publisher's website. There's an example of where that information is for the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that explains what you're allowed to do as an author, or you can look up the journal in the Sherpa Romeo database. Now, did Amy talk about Sherpa Romeo yesterday? Okay, so you've seen that. The nice thing about Sherpa Romeo is it presents this information in a consistent format. You look at it once or twice, and you can spot very quickly what it is you're allowed to do. The publisher's website, of course, is maybe more up to date because it's maintained by the publisher, but it can be harder to find the information that you're after. So there are basically a couple of questions to how do I go about self-archiving. They are, what do I post and where can I post it? So the as you proceed through the review process, you'll have a bunch of different versions of your paper, and different versions are allowable for posting by different publishers under different circumstances. So kind of of course, the best case scenario is that you could post the publisher's PDF at some point. That's kind of rare if it's not an open access journal, but that may be the case, or it may be the case after 6 or 12 months. The next best case is that you could post what's called the postprint, and that is the last best version of your manuscript after peer review, after you've made changes in response to peer review, and before the publisher applies their formatting and does their copy editing. So it's kind of the last best draft. That's the postprint. If you're not allowed to post that, you might still be allowed to post the preprint, which is your last best draft before peer review. What you can do, again, depends on the terms of your publishing agreement. And do know that any of these systems to which you might post one of these papers, they don't know what version you're posting. They don't know what you're allowed to do. Just because you can click and upload doesn't mean that you are legally entitled to do that. It's really up to you to understand the terms of your publishing arrangement and then do what's allowable under those terms. In terms of where to share, you're going to hear more about Archive, which is a preprint service. There are more preprint services popping up in a whole range of disciplines almost weekly, it seems. I put a little asterisk next to Earth Archive because there was an interesting blog post from PLOS One last fall where they noted that their editors are actually paying attention to incoming submissions in Earth Archive to find articles that they want to publish in one of those journals. So if you're posting preprints to one of these services and don't yet know where you're going to publish, you might get some nice visibility and an opportunity to publish depending on, you know, who's monitoring what comes in. Funders maintain some repositories for these publications. PubMed Central is maintained by the National Library of Medicine of the National Institutes of Health. Department of Energy has a system called Pages, which the National Science Foundation also uses. And you may be required as a condition of funding from one of those agencies to post some version of your paper to one of those repositories. So preprint services like Archive, Engineering Archive, those might be options for you. These agency-based repositories might be requirements. Another option is Cornell's digital repository eCommons, which I just mentioned. Anyone with a Cornell affiliation can post something there. And then there are these other general purpose sharing platforms like ResearchGate and academia.edu. And I have caveats noted there because these are, it's important to know that these are commercial services. The domain name of academia.edu notwithstanding, they actually got that domain name before it became a requirement that that only be assigned to educational domains. So it's a commercial outfit in spite of their name. And like Google, like Facebook, when you use a platform like that, they're providing you with a free service because they're really interested in pulling you in to use the service so they can track your use, your connections, your data, and monetize that in some way that makes profit for them in some other way that you might not be aware of. So if you want to use those services, just make sure you're reading the privacy terms, the terms of use, and are comfortable with them. And then finally, you know, of course, you can post something to a personal website. So the things to think about as you select among these options are, you know, what are you required to do as a condition of your funding? Where do you want visibility for your work? Do you want visibility in a disciplinary context like Archive? Do you want visibility in a institutional context like Cornell? Or, you know, as everybody you know, using ResearchGate? And then again, think about the terms and think about the services that they offer. So if you're concerned about the longevity of your work, is this a preservation-friendly environment? A personal website is probably not a good long-term strategy for sharing your work. It's a good short-term strategy. So, you know, what are the services associated with each of these platforms and which ones matter to you? So I guess, are there any questions on any of that so far? So I'm just going to wrap up with my summary of best practices here, which are manage your rights, listen to Amy, do what she said, understand the requirements of your funding, source of funding, hang on to your publishing agreements, hang on to these key versions of your papers, the preprint, the postprint, and the publisher's PDF, and identify them as such so that 6 months from now, you know which thing can be used for which purpose. I hope you'll be interested in publishing open access. If you are unable to publish in an open access journal, do consider self-archiving as an alternative to complement traditional publishing. And then think carefully about any of the services that you might use. Yeah.
So those that there's a recent citation rates after those site know any this is true or not.
They are really good at search engine optimization. If you search for papers on the internet, quite often academia.edu's copy will appear near the top. And so it's true that they're good at search engine optimization, which means people are going to find it and use it. Just as a side note, I want to caution you that if you click through that result, you will get a really quick screen that says, by accessing this paper, you agree to something or other. It's not at all clear that when you click that, you're actually signing up for an academia.edu account. It's how they kind of suck people in very effectively, and people don't even know that's what's happening. So, if people find your paper, yeah, it probably will get cited more, and they really have mastered search engine optimization.
Is there an increase in citation rates?
Yeah, there's a lot of research on that, and it kind of I've seen it go both ways. I don't feel like that story has been fully resolved, and if we do move to a much more open world, of course, the open access advantage will diminish, right? Because everything will be open. So as long as we're kind of caught in this in between, that's a possibility. But I think the research has been kind of inconclusive on that front. Anything else? When you get the slides, I've tried to compile links to most of the things that I referenced in my slides on the last page. So, all right, thank you very much.